Hello, and welcome to Door County Coastal Terrestrial Invasive Species Education Workshops. These videos are made possible through funding by the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program and NOAA. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on a handful of spring flowering invasive plants that you are likely to see on your own property or along roads and trails. The overarching goal of these plant identification videos is to not overwhelm you with every single species that might be non-native to our region, but more to give you a solid, confident yes or no on a few of the most common ones, and plus how to tell them apart from other lookalikes that you may want. So in this video, we're going to be covering just a few: garlic mustard, Dame's rocket, creeping bellflower, tansy, goutweed, and wild chervil. For each of these, I'll cover three things: where it came from and why it's here, a short list of key identification features, and one or two common lookalikes so you don't accidentally pull the wrong plant. And by the end, you should feel comfortable spotting at least a couple of these on your own. So we'll start off with garlic mustard. Most people are probably pretty familiar with this. It is native to Eurasia and was brought to North America in the mid-1800s, and it was intentionally introduced for herbal and medicinal uses and even as an erosion control plant. Garlic mustard thrives in part shades to partly sunny sites, so you'll often see it along woodland edges, under trees, and along shady trail margins. If you have a wooded backyard or a fence line with some shade, this is one to watch out for. Garlic mustard is biennial, so what that means is it lives for 2 years. In the first year, it just sort of forms a low rosette of leaves, as seen in the bottom picture. And then in the second year, it sends up a flowering stalk with tiny little white flowers. Its leaves are roughly heart-shaped with scalloped edges and pronounced veins, so along the edges just have little bumps, not sharp teeth, and they tend to be relatively wrinkled looking. The flowers are very small and white with 4 petals, and then they develop into these long upright seed pods like cylindrical capsules along the stem. A really helpful test for garlic mustard, especially on the first year plants, is the smell test. It's not called garlic mustard for a reason. If you crush a leaf between your fingers, it should have a garlicky or slightly oniony smell to it. A few lookalikes that you may encounter are Creeping Charlie or our native violets. So there are multiple violets in our region, so this is going to be, the violets is just very broad. So garlic mustard, as I mentioned, has that fragrant leaf, and then the leaf tips are a little bit more rounded than the other two. Creeping Charlie, however, can look similar, but it has opposite leaves along the stem, and it tends to just be a creeping, viney plant that stays along the ground, so very much of a ground cover sort of plant. And then when it does flower, it will have small little purple flowers along the stem. And then violets can be heart-shaped too, but the leaf tips of those are going to be more pointed, not so rounded. And the leaves won't have any sort of fragrance to them. And those flower colors will range from purple, blue, dark blue, to white or even yellow. And then they will arise from the base of the plant. They don't send up a long, tall flowering stalk like garlic mustard will. Dame's rocket is another very showy plant that we have here that's not native. It was brought over from Europe in the early 1600s, mainly as an ornamental plant. As you can see by this picture here, it does have very colorful, beautiful blooms and does have a long flowering window. So throughout the season, once it starts blooming, you'll have weeks upon weeks of flowering plants with this species. And it also is very fragrant. Sadly, it was actually promoted in some of these native wildflower seed mixes, which is ironic since it's not actually native to North America. So Dame's rockets will have alternating leaves, that are shaped almost like a lance, and they have very small, fine teeth along the edges that are sort of widely spaced out. The lower leaves will have a bit of a stalk to them, so they will have a little petiole, but then the upper leaves will be much more pressed to the stem without a stalk. And then the whole plant, the leaves and the stems, are relatively hairy. When it flowers, they can have a wide range of flowers, even with flower color, even within the same population. So purple, pink, white, and they almost always appear in these loose clusters. It's very similar to garlic mustard, where it sends up that flowering stalk. Dame's rocket will do the same thing. And then each flower will have 4 petals, and then will produce these long, skinny seed pods, as you can see here in this plant. So this picture here that has both the flowers at the top, and then those long tendrils are actually the seed pods that are starting to develop. Some lookalikes. There's really only one lookalike, and that's going to be our native phlox. There are, again, multiple species that can occur in Wisconsin for phlox, but the phlox species will generally all have these same characteristics that set it apart from Dame's rocket. So phlox is going to have opposite leaves, whereas the Dame's rocket has alternate leaves. So on a stem, phlox's leaves will always be right across from each other, and Dame's rocket's sort of step side up the stems. If you have flowers, that's another good way to tell the difference between the species. Phlox will always have 5 petals, where Dame's rocket will only have 4 petals. Creeping bellflower, again, was introduced from Europe and Western Asia, and introduced for ornamental plants. Just like the Dame's rocket, it has very big, showy flowers. The exact time it was introduced is really unclear, but probably believed to be introduced sometime during the colonial times. It would bring over a lot of new species that reminded them of home to make that transition a little bit more bearable for them, I would say. And this is a really versatile plant, so it can grow in part sun, part shade, sunny sites, in lawns, gardens, along edges, and it creeps via rhizomes, hence the name creeping, and it makes it challenging to get rid of once it's established in a site. So the leaves of creeping bellflower are going to be heart-shaped, about 2 to 4 inches long, and they taper into a tip, and the edges of these leaves are toothed. Sometimes if you break the stem of the plant, it will have a milky salve. And like I said earlier, the one big challenge with this plant is that creeping root system. The deep fleshy roots, so when you're pulling it out, you often will leave some behind and just have to do some follow-up work on there. So the flowers of creeping bellflower are that classic drooping bell-shaped blossom, usually a light purple, varying from lighter to darker. One thing with creeping bellflower is the attachment's all going to be on one side of the stem. So some plants will kind of alternate around the stem for flowers. That'll be one key difference between some of the other things that'll happen there. So there are other native bellflowers to our region that potentially could look very similar. So the American bellflower in the center there, the flowers are going to be more saucer shaped. So they don't have that bellflower, they open kind of wide in shape versus the creeping bellflower. And the flowers here, as you can see in that picture, are kind of circulating around the stem, whereas in the creeping bellflower, you can see they're all sort of facing the same direction, whatever direction that might be. Another bellflower that is native to our region is harebell. This one is a much more delicate plant, going to be very diminutive compared to the creeping bellflower or even the American bellflower. The stems are going to be much more thin, and the flowers will be individually stalked, so they don't have big clusters of flowers. Tansy for Door County is kind of an up-and-coming non-native species, I would say. It is here, but has not really been observed in large abundance. So it is native to Europe and Eurasia and was introduced sometime in the 1600s for treatment of various things, including constipation, hysteria, and intestinal worms, of all things. The leaves also had other uses. They were used to wrap corpses to prevent rapid decay, and they are also used to protect meats from flies and ants. So, just have a little bit of trivia for game night one time. More recently, tansy has been researched for use as an insecticide or mosquito repellent, not a recommended use for the plant, as the plant and essential oils contain compounds that can be toxic to humans, livestock, and wildlife. So definitely not something I would suggest using for any sort of medicinal usage or other uses. So and with this one, it really prefers that full sunny site. It can handle some part shade, but you're typically going to find it in sunny spots, such as roadsides, fields, anywhere that you have some disturbance. So these leaves are really interesting and unique. They're very fern-like, so they're going to be very long, 4 to 10 inches long, and they are deeply lobed. So you can see in between each of those little leaves, it goes almost all the way to that midrib of this leaf stem. And then it also does have toothed edges. And one really good identifying feature for this plant is its smell. So if you were to crush a leaf, it just has a very strong, pungent smell to it. So tansy has very noticeable flowers. They're golden yellow buttons, and they're in flat clusters at the top of the plants, rising up to about 2 to 4 feet. There are some lookalikes here. We do have a native tansy in our region. The native tansy is heavily restricted to our coastal regions, so the sand dunes along Lake Michigan. And the biggest thing with that one is it's going to be a much smaller plant. So we're talking under 3 feet tall, less flower heads. The leaves will be a little bit smaller as well. I do not know if they would have a fragrant smell to them at all. I would assume so, since they are in the same genus. So if you come across anything that has that fern-like leaf, give it a little crush and just see if it smells fragrant or not, and then kind of assess where you're at on your habitat. If you're in your dunal regions, the sand dunes, there's a chance you may have a native one, but if you're in a disturbed area, it's more likely you have the non-native version. So goutweed, again, native to Asia and Europe, like most of the species that we've been talking about. It also goes by names of bishop's weed or snow on the mountain, and this is one of those other cases where it started off as a garden plant. So it was introduced as an ornamental, and it really touted as a great ground cover for some of those shady, hard to grow areas. It can pretty much withstand anything you throw it at. It's a very ecologically versatile plant. So it forms that solid, low maintenance cover. So that thing that I was touted for the good thing for gardens is that same trait that makes it a serious problem when it escapes into our native habitats. Now I will say it's not something that's really escaped much, but I do know a lot of people have goutweed, and some people are really trying to control it, or maybe don't know what they have. So with goutweed, they have kind of interesting leaves. So they are compound leaves. So this whole structure here is a leaf coming up from the base of the plant, and then at the top of it has little leaflets, very similar to what poison ivy would be like, or an ash tree. You have one big complex of a leaf and then smaller little leaflets in there. So the leaflets have toothed edges and often look a little bit irregular or lobed sometimes, especially the lower ones. And often you'll see some variegation on this left-hand picture there where you have the whiteness on the leaves. So that's the cultivar from Snow on the Mountain. And plants will sometimes recess into all green. So if you had planted this one there, just because you don't see that white, not necessarily the same thing you might have planted. So goutweed, when it does flower, has very small white flowers that are arranged in those flat top clusters, very similar to Queen Anne's lace, similar structure to tansy we just saw a few slides ago. And there are a few things that look similar and also kind of have some slightly weedy tendencies, I would say. So you might be confused by some of these here. So our Osmorrhiza, or the sweet Sicilies, there are a couple of different species in our region. And then honewort. So both of these plants do have divided leaves and white umbels of flowers, so those white clusters there. The key difference, though, is in that growth pattern. Goutweed will usually form dense colonies and carpets the ground with the same plant over a large patch, but these native ones will just sort of make clusters of plants here and there. So a few other characteristics that sort of set it apart. With the Osmorrhiza species, those stems are going to be hairy, as you can see in that far left picture. Those hairs are on that stem are sticking straight out. And then the fruits, when they do make fruits, they will actually end up sticking to you as you're walking through them. So one other thing that you might notice there. And then with honewort, they don't form as dense of colonies, and then the flowers are just going to be a little bit more small and sparsely scattered along there. So wild cheverel is one of those plants up here in Door County that's quite uncommon. So as you see in that map of Wisconsin, that upper right-hand corner, Door County falls into an area that's shaded red. So these maps come from the Wisconsin DNR, and they are how our invasive species law in R40 sort of regulates invasive species. So they're put into two categories: prohibited and restricted. Prohibited species are ones that are not widely spread throughout the region or in very isolated spots and areas. So here in Door County, we have very few populations of wild cheverel, or any. So if we were to find some of that, it's something that we would really want to take care of to control it in a timely fashion so it doesn't spread and become more of a serious problem. So wild cheverel was native to Eurasia and actually a relatively new introduction to North America, I believe sometime in the 1900s. It is in the same carrot family, so your Queen Anne's lace and other things like that, so it's going to have that fragrant smell to it. And it was actually once touted in to have wild seed mixes, and has also been used as a culinary herb in some places, which has helped it sort of spread beyond gardens. So the leaves of wild cheverel are finely divided in fern-like. So fern-like's a term that gets tossed around a lot. So it's just big, airy leaves is the best way I can describe it. So they have small parts to them. They're very delicate looking. And they can often be compound 2 or 3 times over. So what that just means is you have the central stalk and another one that has more on there. So as this top picture here, you can sort of see the whole thing is one leaf, and then each branch has that's a leaflet, and then even there it divides out even more. And a single leaf, so that whole shape, a whole structure, can be up to 8 inches long and 8 inches wide, so forming that really broad triangular shape. The small leaf segments are really deeply divided, and the undersides of the leaves can have some short hairs all in them. And the stems of the plant are rigid and usually hairy on the lower portion of the plant, so towards the base, and then as you move up towards the top of the plant, they usually tend up to be a little bit more smooth, so less hairs. So this kind of shows you here just how hairy the stems can actually be, very pronounced along those ridges, which is pretty unique characteristic for plants. So like your carrot family plants, it's going to have this white flowers on a cluster. So very much like Queen Anne's lace, just like the goutweed or / bishop's weed that we just saw a few slides ago. One helpful feature though for wild chervil is the teardrop shaped bract just below the flower cluster. So you can see in this bottom picture there, you've got that little leafy appendage just below the seed pods there. So that's what they're talking about when we mention the bract. Then after the plant flowers, it produces sort of egg-shaped fruits that turn from green into black as they mature. So we are not going to dive into all the lookalikes that wild chervil might have, because since it is in the carrot family, there's going to be a lot of different things that can look like it. This table here just shows you the things that can look like it. So you've got your goutweed that we saw a few slides ago, Queen Anne's lace, which we haven't talked about today, but is quite common throughout Door County. And then it's just a few of these other ones. They're all going to have very similar structures for leaves, and then the flower structure going to be very similar. And there's going to be multiple characteristics that sort of needed to differentiate between the different species on this list. So kind of looking at the overall size, whether the stem is hairy or smooth. Some of these species like poison hemlock and giant hogweed, we're going to have purple blotches on the stem, which is a distinctive feature. What do the seeds look like? When does it bloom? If you're not sure what you're dealing with, especially for the carrot family, it's safer to take a clear photo and get an ID before mowing it or pulling it, especially if you think something might be in the hogweed or the hemlock group. Giant hogweed has characteristics similar to wild parsnip, where if you were to get the sap or the juices of the plant on your skin and expose that to the sunlight, you can end up with some blisters and boils happening on your skin. And then poison hemlock, which is not found in our county yet, is hence its name, poison. So it's just not something you really want to mess around with too much. You won't have any issues if you touch it, but it is poisonous if ingested. So if you ever have any questions about anything in the carrot family, take some photos, send them to someone like myself, or use one of the resources online that we can talk about in another video. And thank you for watching.